What if I told you there was once a man whose death was so brutal, so publicly orchestrated that even his enemies whispered about it for centuries? He wasn't just killed, he was dismantled piece by piece while an entire city watched. And the most chilling part, this horror was designed not in the heat of battle, but in the cold, calculating mind of a king. This is the true story of William Wallace, Scotland's most defiant rebel, and how his execution became the most terrifying warning in medieval history. Hit that subscribe button because you're about to hear what really happened, and it's nothing like the Hollywood version. They called him a traitor. Scotland called him a hero. England wanted him erased. On a warm August morning in 1305, London's cobblestone streets echoed not with merchants' calls, but with the rising roar of thousands who had gathered to see one thing: the destruction of a man who had dared to stand against an empire. The man they awaited was not a king or a prince. William Wallace had no crown, no royal blood. He was a minor landowner turned warrior, a man whose family had suffered under English occupation. His rise was born not from ambition but from outrage, a fury so deep it ignited a movement that terrified England's most powerful ruler. King Edward IV of England, known as Longshanks, had a reputation for crushing defiance. He expelled entire peoples, flattened rebellions, and treated conquered lands as trophies. To him, rebellion was like wildfire. You didn't just stamp it out, you salted the earth so nothing could grow again. Wallace wasn't just an opponent. He was a spark, and Longshanks would make sure that spark burned no more. In 1297, Wallace led a victory at Stirling Bridge that shattered the illusion of English invincibility. Heavy cavalry. England's pride had been humiliated. The win was more than a battle, it was a message Scotland could fight back. And that was the problem. By 1305, Wallace was the last prominent Scot refusing English rule. Most nobles had bent the knee, choosing survival over resistance. Wallace's defiance made him an embarrassment not only to England, but also to the Scottish elite who had chosen submission. His very existence questioned their loyalty and their courage. The hunt for him was relentless. Spies shadowed him. Former allies avoided him. A bounty hung over his head promising wealth to whoever delivered him alive. And then, as in so many tragedies, betrayal came from within. Sir John Menteith, a fellow Scot, handed Wallace to the English. Some say it was for survival, others for gold. Whatever the reason, the result was the same: the lion was caged. His journey south was a slow-motion humiliation. Shackled guarded, he was paraded through English towns like a trophy. Crowds jeered, spat, and hurled insults. Every step was a reminder. This is what happens to those who defy the crown. It wasn't just transport, it was psychological warfare softening him for the nightmare to come. On August 23, 1305, Wallace stood trial at Westminster Hall. The charges treason, murder, sacrilege were read in Latin, a language he likely didn't understand. But when given a chance to speak, he made it clear, "I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." It was defiance until the end, and it sealed his fate. The sentence was chillingly precise. He would be dragged through the streets hanged, but cut down alive, disemboweled, beheaded, and quartered. Each act carried symbolic meaning. His body degraded, his soul rejected his humanity, stripped, his very existence erased. Edward III wasn't just killing a man. He was building a performance, one that would be remembered for centuries. The morning sun rose over London, casting long shadows between timbered houses. It should have been an ordinary day, but the city was alive with anticipation. Vendors abandoned their usual calls of fresh bread or fish. Instead, they sold ale and meat pies to the thousands streaming toward the execution route. This wasn't justice, it was theater, and everyone wanted a seat. Inside the Tower of London, Wallace was stripped of dignity as well as clothing. His wrists were bound tight with coarse rope that burned his skin. Outside the wooden hurdle, a flat splintered board awaited him. It would not carry him gently. It would drag him across cobblestones like refuse. The English called it drawing, but it was more like grinding a man into the earth before killing him. 2 horses were harnessed to the hurdle, their hooves restless on the stone. Guards seized Wallace, forcing him face up onto the plank. His hair tangled his back, pressed into the wood's cruel edges. A chain rattled over his chest. Then, with a jerk, the horses moved, and the procession began. The route wound through London's busiest streets, deliberately chosen to pass markets, churches and inns, anywhere the crowd was thickest. Children darted forward to glimpse the infamous Scot, then recoiled at the sight of a man bleeding already from the road's jagged stones, his eyes fixed on some point far beyond the jeers and insults. Some threw refuse-rotten vegetables, clumps of mud. Others spat. But the cruelty didn't come only from the mob. The soldiers slowed the horses at key points, forcing Wallace to endure the taunts longer, his humiliation stretched like the rope that bound him. The soundscape was overwhelming, the creak of harness leather, the clatter of hooves, the roar of the crowd rising and falling like waves. Somewhere above it all, a church bell tolled not in mourning, but in grim ceremony. Through it all, Wallace remained silent. Witnesses would later say he never begged for mercy, never cried out. Whether this was stubborn defiance, stoic resignation, or the shock of pain was impossible to tell. But his silence was louder than any scream. Finally, after what felt like hours, the procession reached Smithfield, London's traditional ground for executions. The field was ringed with scaffolds, taverns, and makeshift stalls, selling everything from meat skewers to commemorative trinkets. The air was thick with smoke from cooking fires and the metallic tang of anticipation. On the central platform stood the executioner, masked, his tools laid out like a butcher's display, ropes, knives, hooks, and axe. The crowd pressed forward, some jostling for a better view, others climbing onto barrels or wagons. This was no solemn affair. It was a festival of cruelty. The first act was hanging. Wallace was hauled upright and the noose slipped over his neck, but the rope was tied short. It would strangle, not break. At the signal, the trap was yanked away and his body convulsed in mid-air, legs kicking face, darkening the struggle, both grotesque and mesmerizing. Just as unconsciousness crept in, the executioner cut him down. The man was still alive, and the real torment was only beginning. The crowd's roar dipped into a hungry hush as the executioner approached with measured, almost ritual calm, and for a suspended heartbeat the entire field seemed to breathe in. Wallace lay heaving on the platform, rope burns banding his throat, vision swimming as the world tilted and righted itself, and somewhere in the distance a hawker called out for ale as if this were a pageant and not a dismantling of a man. The soldiers formed a ring of iron around the scaffold. Spears turned outward, not to protect Wallace, but to protect the spectacle from interruption. And when the executioner knelt beside him, tilting his head with a gloved hand, as a master appraises a difficult task, even the bravest in the front ranks swallowed hard, for everyone knew that hanging was meant to weaken. Not to finish what came next was the center of the show. The portion mothers would pretend never happened, and men would retell in low voices as if speaking of a forbidden rite. A clerk in a dark hood stepped forward to read the formal words again. Traitor, murderer, sacrilege intoned in Latin, as if holiness could sanctify cruelty. And as each charge rolled out, the executioner arranged his tools upon the table with the intimacy of a surgeon who has done this too many times. A brazier was stoked hotter until it glowed like an embered sun, and oily smoke curled upward, threading itself through the beams of the scaffold, carrying with it a smell that turned the tongue metallic. A drummer beat a slow cadence, not triumphant but deliberate. A controlled heartbeat for a city watching itself in the mirror. And in that rhythm, London remembered its power. and Scotland measured its loss, and somewhere between them a single man breathed in shallow, stubborn sips. They bound Wallace again, not upright this time, but supine arms stretched and secured ankles, fixed the executioner, testing each knot with a tug that said he knew where and how a body fights back. The ropes were rough, peppered with old fibers and sweat from 100 other mornings, and when they pulled the table forward to the very lip of the platform to give the crowd a better sightline, the front rows leaned instinctively the way one leans toward a cliff, not to fall, but to feel the edge. The priest raised a small cross and murmured a blessing for the form's sake. Whether for the condemned or for the city's soul, no one could tell, and Wallace, jaw-clenched, eyes unfixed upon some point beyond the sky, seemed to gather himself as if folding pain into a single place where it could be held and starved of air. The knife glinted a narrow crescent, catching daylight, and the hush that followed was not silence so much as concentrated sound. The shuffle of boots, the wet pop from the brazier, the impatient whicker of a horse beyond the cordon. What London had come to see was not death, but a lesson written on flesh, a performance of sovereignty in which mercy was the one ingredient forbidden. And as the blade descended, the executioner's movements were practiced to an art inflicting not chaos, but a sequence calibrated step by step to suspend a man between worlds for as long as the watchers could endure, for as long as the message required. Even those who hated Wallace felt against their will the gravity of what was being done, as if some pact older than law and crown was being broken and could not be mended again. Witnesses later said that the air changed thicker, heavier, an atmosphere rather than a breeze, and that the crowd's faces shifted from appetite to awe. Not the reverent kind, but the dreadful kind that arrives when a spectacle crosses the line into myth. The drummer slowed as if to give space to the horror, and for a moment you could hear individual sounds, someone sobbing, a vendor muttering a prayer, a soldier clearing his throat like a man who wants to be somewhere else. The executioner intent lifted proofs of the deed for all to see before consigning them to the flame, which flared and then settled. And in that ritualized display the symbolism was unmissable, even to the dullest mind. Here is compassion unmade, here is defiance unthreaded. Here is a body used to write a warning across the sky of a conquered land. Yet the man on the table did not plead, and this refusal, whether born of courage numbness or an exhaustion so complete, it had no words traveled through the onlookers like a rumor of weather, changing the temperature of their hearts. A boy on his father's shoulders asked a question that the father could not answer, and an old woman made the sign of the cross, though she had never once pitied a Scot. People who had come to enjoy the justice of their king felt a new thing, squeezing their ribs from within. A discomfort, not with the law, but with what law becomes when it forgets. The subject is human, and if some turned away, others stared harder, as if the more they stared, the quicker the scene would end. And if no one shouted stop, still something in the city wished it had the courage to try. There is a moment in all such spectacles when the crowd must choose whether to be audience or accomplice, and London, trained for centuries to respect ceremony, chose the safety of watching. The officials, relieved, pressed on with the choreography, and the executioner, who needed no orders, worked with the same grim competence he would bring to a harvest, never hurried, never pausing longer than necessary, keeping his victim alive. Because that was the point, that the king's reach extended to the very border between life and death, and could hold a rebel on that narrow strip as proof of dominion. When the priest tried once more to offer words, a captain silenced him with a glance, for pity was not on the program. At last, the axe was brought forth, newly whetted its edge as bright as winter water, and the crowd's noise rose again, not in joy but in release, for the end of a terror is its own relief. Wallace was unbound from the table and hauled to his knees as if a final posture of submission must be staged, and when they forced his head to the block, he lifted his chin upon the wood with a steadiness that surprised even his enemies, as if offering not surrender, but a last fierce signature upon the day. The executioner hefted the axe to test the balance, adjusted his stance, and the drummer changed tempo to a cadence that every London child could mimic by nightfall. The stroke itself was a clean soundwood steel, a single shout from somewhere far back, and then a ripple that passed through thousands of bodies at once like a gust through wheat, and for a second the city felt hollowed as if the echo had taken something with it. The head was raised, displayed, then passed to attendants who worked briskly at their craft. And though the worst had ended for the man, the lesson was not yet finished for the nation, because the sentence did not stop at death. Tar was heated and brushed with quick strokes until the trophy shone, not to honor him, but to preserve the warning, a dark lantern set to burn over London Bridge, where the river winds like a boundary between memory and forgetting. Quartering followed methodical, unceremonious. A butcher's partition made sacred by banners and law, and each portion wrapped and tagged with orders became a message destined for the North. A set of black letters written in flesh, to Newcastle, to Berwick, to Stirling, to Perth, as if the king could nail silence into the very gates of Scotland. Soldiers rolled the scaffold boards clean while the vendors resumed their sales, and already the story was beginning to harden into the shape it would take for generations. To the English an example, to the Scots a martyrdom, to Europe a glimpse of a power willing to rule by pageant of terror. And above the emptied field a flock of birds turned once in a dark wheel and then scattered as if even the sky wished to forget what it had seen. News of the execution raced through London faster than the Thames tide, spilling from tavern to market, whispered in alleys, and shouted from stalls. Some recounted the spectacle with the thrill of having been there. Others spoke of it with a careful, almost guilty precision, as if the details might cling to them like soot. The head on London Bridge became an instant landmark, a grisly compass point for sailors and traders alike. Those who crossed beneath it could not help but glance upward, seeing the tar-slick face staring over the river as though still watching the city that had feasted on his pain. For King Edward's court, the execution was a triumph, a statement chiseled into history. Couriers were dispatched with the 4 quarters of Wallace's body, each wrapped in cloth but not hidden, for secrecy was the enemy of fear. Newcastle would display one leg, Berwick, another Stirling, an arm. Perth, the last, a gruesome map of conquest pinned to Scotland itself. The journeys were slow, deliberate, designed to give every village on the road a glimpse of what awaited those who defied the crown. In Newcastle, townsfolk gathered at the gates to see the arrival of their portion. Children were lifted onto shoulders, and the local officials, grim-faced, supervised the mounting of the relic high upon the city walls. The guards said nothing, but the message spoke for itself. The king's justice could reach anywhere, and once it touched you, it left nothing whole. Berwick's display was even more calculated. The quarter was hung above the main approach road, forcing every Scot who dared to trade or travel into English territory to pass under it. Some spat in defiance, others lowered their eyes, but all felt the weight of that silent warning. The smell carried on the wind made the threat visceral. It was not just policy, it was decay given form. Stirling, once the site of Wallace's greatest victory, received its grim gift with a mix of horror and pride. Old soldiers who had fought beside him stood in the crowd, their faces carved from stone, refusing to weep where English eyes might see. To them, the mutilated limb was not a warning, but a relic proof that Wallace had stayed true until the end, and that even in pieces he could still return to the place where he had humbled an empire. Perth's turn came last. The quarter arrived under heavy guard, though no one expected an attack. The English commander ordered it fixed to the tallest gate tower visible for miles across the surrounding fields. Farmers plowing their land could look up and see it swaying in the wind, an unspoken demand for obedience. But in the taverns and cottages, the stories began to twist. The English meant the flesh to say, "Fear us." The Scots began to hear, instead, "Remember him." Back in London, the head endured the seasons. Rain slicked it dark. Summer heat cracked the tar. Sailors returning from the North Sea claimed they could spot it from their decks, a black dot against the bridge's pale stone. Foreign merchants asked about it with morbid curiosity, and some took the tale home to their own kings. England's reputation as a land of ruthless justice grew, and with it a quiet wariness from neighbors who understood that such cruelty could just as easily be turned upon them. But the king's intended fear began to erode almost immediately in Scotland. The brutal theater meant to erase Wallace instead etched him deeper into the national soul. Ballads whispered in glens and sung low in taverns turned his silence on the scaffold into legend. Children learned his name before they could read, not as a warning, but as a promise that England's grip could never fully close. Even among the Scottish nobility who had once shunned him, a change took root. Some were shamed by his endurance. Others, calculating, saw that England's wrath could not be bargained with forever. In council halls and private chambers, alliances began to shift. The cause Wallace had embodied not just independence but defiance gained new champions, some driven by principle, others by the simple need to survive a master who ruled by fear. And far from the castles and courts in the hidden places where rebels nursed their wounds, Wallace's death became a rallying cry. Men who had sworn never to take up arms again found their hands closing once more around the hilts of their swords. Mothers told their sons that the English could kill a man, but they could not kill his name. The king had intended the execution to end a rebellion. Instead, he had given it a martyr whose shadow would outlive them all. In the months that followed, Wallace's story began to move beyond Scotland's hills, and England's courts carried by merchants' envoys and wandering minstrels who embroidered truth with myth. In the ports of Flanders and the marketplaces of France, people spoke of the Scottish rebel who faced the full cruelty of England without a single cry for mercy. Some claimed he stared down his executioner. Others swore he smiled. The details shifted with every telling, but the essence remained a man who would not bend even when broken. Foreign rulers listened closely. For France, often at odds with England, the tale was a reminder of their rivals' harshness, an image to be painted in the colors of tyranny. In the courts of Castile and the Holy Roman Empire, ambassadors repeated the story weighing the measure of a king who would carve up his enemies like livestock. Such ferocity could be a deterrent, but it could also breed isolation, for no monarch trusts a neighbor who rules by spectacle of cruelty. In Rome, whispers reached the ears of church officials. Some saw in Wallace's fate a challenge to the sanctity of life, others a necessary punishment for rebellion. The Vatican's archives would one day hold letters debating whether Edward's justice had gone too far, whether the execution had crossed the line from law into vengeance. The discussion, though quiet, marked the beginning of an idea that would grow in centuries to come, that even the state must answer for the dignity of the condemned. Back in Scotland, the legend hardened like iron in the forge. Poets sang of the man who walked to death as to a wedding, turning the scaffold into an altar of sacrifice. Carvings in chapel corners and symbols scratched into the beams of alehouses became private tributes. A sword, a bridge, a face, staring defiantly forward. These marks were small acts of rebellion, ways to keep his presence alive, where English eyes might not notice. The shockwaves reached the battlefield as well. Wallace's gruesome end convinced many Scots that capture was worse than death. Soldiers began to fight with a new ferocity, preferring to fall where they stood rather than risk the king's justice. It was a change in the very rhythm of war. Skirmishes grew bloodier, prisoners fewer, mercy rarer. England had won the man, but lost the illusion that conquest could ever be clean. Robert the Bruce, a noble who had once navigated the dangerous middle ground between submission and rebellion, found in Wallace's death both a warning and an inspiration. He saw how the English crown intended to rule not by negotiation, but by domination. The spectacle at Smithfield convinced him that the only answer was complete independence, and that half measures would lead only to the same scaffold. As years passed, Wallace's execution began to take on the weight of prophecy. Every fresh act of English oppression seemed to confirm what his death had shown, that the crown valued obedience over justice, fear over peace. The memory of his drawn and quartered body became a kind of scripture for the resistance read aloud in the silence before a charge, or murmured to steady the hands of men in the dark before battle. In the lowlands, traveling storytellers would set up in market squares, drawing crowds with the promise of the true end of Wallace. They painted the scene in lurid detail, the dragging through London, the jeering crowds, the brazier's heat, the defiance in his eyes. Some in the audience wept, others clenched their fists, but all left with the story lodged in their minds, ready to pass it on. Even children played games in his name. In one, a rope was tied between two posts, and one child would pretend to be Wallace, refusing to fall until the others pulled him down. It was a morbid kind of heroism born from the mingling of pride and grief. Parents did not stop them. They knew that keeping his memory alive in the smallest ways was its own quiet act of resistance. The English crown, for all its triumph, had sown seeds it could not unplant. Wallace's death was meant to be a closing chapter. Instead, it became the opening of a longer, harsher story. His name would become a rallying cry in years to come, invoked before charges at Bannockburn, whispered in the ears of spies carved into prison walls by men awaiting their own turn at the king's justice. Edward had intended to silence a rebel. He had instead given birth to a legend. Decades later, long after the blood had dried on the scaffold at Smithfield, Wallace's story still traveled on the breath of the people. Farmers told it to their sons as they sharpened scythes. Fishermen murmured it over the sound of the waves. Each retelling smoothed some edges and sharpened others, transforming a brutal execution into a parable about dignity, loyalty, and the cost of freedom. The first chroniclers to write his tale were not neutral. English scribes recorded the event in crisp, detached Latin, focusing on the charges, and the justice served as if it were a tidy matter of law. Scottish writers, fewer in number but richer in passion, painted the scene as a martyrdom. Every act of cruelty a halo, every refusal to plead for mercy a crown. Truth lay somewhere between, but by then truth had already been claimed by the side that needed it most. Ballads began to drift into the Highlands, woven with pipes and drum beats. They spoke of the man who stood taller than the scaffold, whose silence drowned out the jeers of London. In these songs, the brazier's smoke curled not as a stench of death, but as the incense of sacrifice. The executioner became a shadow, the crowd a blur, the focus always on the unbroken figure at the center. Generations later, mothers still used his name to quiet quarrels or stiffen courage. "Remember Wallace," they would say to a child too frightened to speak up, or to a young man wavering before a fight. The phrase carried no need for explanation. It was understood that Wallace meant defiance, that Wallace meant standing, even when standing meant falling. Meanwhile, in England, the memory of his death was less celebrated, but it lingered nonetheless. Londoners spoke of the day the Scot was dragged through their streets, some with pride, others with a flicker of unease. The older ones remembered the silence, the way it had unnerved them, the way it had seemed to hollow out the cheers, until only the sound of the axe remained. Across Europe, his name occasionally surfaced in debates about justice. Philosophers and clerics used his trial as an example, either of the necessity of punishing rebellion or of the danger of letting justice become a spectacle of cruelty. The image of the quartered body, the head above the bridge, became a shorthand for the extremes to which power will go when it feels threatened. In the courts of France, Wallace's defiance fed the growing idea that no ruler should be absolute, that there must be a balance between king and people. It was whispered among scholars that had Wallace lived in another age, he might have been remembered not as a rebel, but as a founder of a nation's rights. This was a dangerous thought, and so it was spoken only in certain company with the door barred and the candles low. By the 15th century, his story had begun to blend with legend. Tales claimed he had walked to the scaffold with a smile, that he had cursed Edward with his last breath, that the rivers of Scotland had run red the day he died. None of it could be proved, but proof was beside the point. In legend, he was no longer a man. He was a symbol untouchable by time or axe. Even the places tied to his capture and death became sites of quiet pilgrimage. Men would pause at the Tower of London and imagine the walls remembering his footsteps. In Stirling, where he had once triumphed, travelers would touch the stones of the bridge as though greeting an old friend. The land itself seemed to hold echoes, as if the air had memorized his defiance. And yet under all the songs and carvings, the truth of Wallace's death remained stark. He had been broken, humiliated, and destroyed in the most public way possible. The English crown had meant it to be a lesson in obedience. It had indeed become a lesson, but not the one intended. The scaffold had taught Scotland that fear can be endured, and that sometimes a single day, even a single moment, can belong to a man more than to a king. As the decades slid into centuries, Wallace's name never faded from Scotland's tongue. In the poorest crofts and the grandest halls, it was spoken with a kind of ownership, as if the man himself belonged to every Scot who ever felt the weight of another's rule. Children who could not yet trace the outline of their own country on a map could still tell with shining eyes the story of the man who would not kneel. Over time, the execution came to be seen not only as an act of cruelty, but as a mirror. It reflected the nature of power in its rawest form, the need to be seen destroying opposition, the hunger to turn a human life into an emblem of control. And yet that very need had exposed the fragility of the crown. If England's might was truly unshakable, why go to such lengths to kill a single man? In this way, Wallace's scaffold became a paradox. It was the scene of his obliteration, and at the same time the forge of his immortality. The same act, meant to erase him, etched his story deeper into the stones of Scotland and into the pages of history. It was proof that the narrative of a life cannot be wholly owned by those who end it. By the dawn of the Enlightenment, philosophers and political thinkers cited Wallace alongside other martyrs of liberty. His defiance under trial became a touchstone in arguments about natural rights and the limits of sovereign power. In pamphlets smuggled across borders, his silence before the jeering crowd was framed as a kind of speech, one that spoke to every people who had ever been told to submit. In Scotland, his image was woven into the national identity. Festivals marked his victories, memorials honored his death. Poets stood on hillsides reciting verses to the wind as if calling him home. Farmers blessed their fields in his name before planting. Sailors swore by him before braving storms. Wallace had become more than a man. He was a thread stitched into the very fabric of the land. Even in England, the story softened over the centuries. The politics that had demanded his destruction faded, replaced by a grudging respect for the man's resolve. Some English historians began to write of him not as a traitor, but as a worthy opponent, a man who fought for what he believed even against impossible odds. It was a quiet shift, but a telling one. The victor's narrative had begun to yield to the truth. And so, what had once been an execution meant to frighten became a lesson meant to inspire. In classrooms and in literature, the details of that August day were still recounted: the dragging, the scaffold, the axe, but now they served to remind students that freedom once lost is rarely regained without cost. The very brutality of Wallace's end had made his cause unkillable. The centuries wore away kings and crowns, but not the echo of Wallace's defiance. His story leapt from parchment to printing press, from folk song to theater, from the lips of storytellers to the reels of modern cinema. Each version altered the details, but the heartbeat of it, the man who faced the unfaceable, stayed the same. In the end, Wallace's true legacy was not in the battles he fought or the victories he claimed, but in the image of him standing before his captors, unbroken in spirit even as they prepared to break his body. It was a legacy of choice, the choice to hold to one's cause when surrender might have bought a longer life, the choice to value principle over breath. More than 700 years have passed since the blood of William Wallace stained the cobblestones of London, yet the questions his life raises still hang in the air. What would you stand for if standing meant falling? What is the price of freedom, and who among us is willing to pay it? His death was meant to close a chapter, but it became a torch, one that still burns, daring each generation to decide whether they will let it go out or carry it forward into the dark.